Well, good morning again and welcome. My name is Christy Kaufman, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Critical Conversations, How to Navigate Difficult Employee Conversations. A couple of housekeeping items. This webinar does qualify for one SHRM and one HRCI credit. We will provide that credit information on the closing slide as well as in a follow-up email. Lastly, we are also recording this session and we will make it available to all of our attendees within 24 hours. It is now my privilege to introduce to you today's panel. I am joined today by the leaders of the Raymond HR Solutions team, Elizabeth Williams, Corrine Conley, and Katie Stewart. Welcome, ladies. Today, we're going to dive into the topic of critical conversations and how your organization and its members can navigate these tough situations. So let's dive in. Elizabeth, as we were preparing for this session, we were discussing this topic and reviewing some of the tips on what to do and what not to do. Can you share with us what these are and more about the roadmap for navigating critical conversations?
Sure, thank you, Christy. Well, conflict and issues in the workplace are common. Every company faces these challenges. It's our intention for today's talk to help managers have these difficult and sometimes uncomfortable conversations at work. Because let's face it, when critical conversations are not held, lingering issues can have negative repercussions on client satisfaction, employee morale, teamwork, and productivity. It can lead to absenteeism and turnover. But even more critical, and especially when issues are not addressed properly, it can create liability and legal issues for the company. So the key is here to have empathy when you're talking with employees, build their trust, be candid but caring when you're having these difficult conversations. And here are some things to keep in mind when talking to an employee. With building trust, it's so important because you're creating that safe environment so the employee feels free to discuss what's really going on. And think about it as to collaborate instead of confronting. Ask employees to identify the problems and be part of finding the solutions rather than just telling them what the problems are and how they need to fix them. And you really want to think about how can you create a feedback culture, which is fostering an environment where challenging conversations become the norm. People aren't afraid to talk and share and bring things up so they don't turn into bigger issues. And as a manager, remember to show your human side. It shows that bit of vulnerability and your concern for them, and that goes a long way. Be candid by providing honest and constructive feedback, and this can genuinely help them grow, and it helps them develop without sacrificing empathy and respect for themselves and what you show for them. And focus on the betterment of the team. When you're explaining an issue that you're having with an employee, it's about the collective whole, the impact that it has on the team. And you want to remove the personal attachments and judgments and biases about that person, the second guessing, because you don't know what really is going on until you ask them.
This information is extremely insightful. But to really better understand these tips and strategies more, let's talk about some real life scenarios that you and your team has faced and how you've handled them. So this question can go out to any of us on the call right now. Issues that many managers and employers face within the workplace can be connected specifically to behavioral issues. Do you have any examples of this? And can you share with us what methods you use to help navigate that situation?
Sure, I can start, Christy.
Sure.
I have a story about a customer service rep at a company that I was with a few years back. This wasn't just a general customer service call-in line. It was a technical service call-in line. And I had an employee who was one of the smartest on the team, and his technical expertise made him so valuable. But his behavior was a problem. Customers were calling in and complaining about how he talked to them rudely or curtly or talked down to them. And some coworkers were not too happy either with his brusqueness and quite honestly, acting better than they are, smarter. Now, the truth is, he might have been, because he had such a high intellect and technical expertise. But the people side of it, and especially with how it was affecting the clientele, was a problem. And so I worked with his manager and directly with the employees, with the employee, and tell me what's going on. And so this employee had a lot of complaints about how things weren't going right. But that open dialogue that we were able to have, the three of us, the manager, myself in HR, and the employee, to say, you are smart, you are valued, but we need to help you smooth out these rough patches that you're having with your coworkers and especially with clients. And that's the feedback that he needed. It was very direct. And what we chose to do is get an outside mentor for him, an actual career coach that could be tough. And it wasn't his manager. It was someone that he could then have these conversations with outside of the regular, the work on the phone. Set aside this time and have that sounding board. And it took a few months, but things definitely turned around. And when you have another party giving that information, and it's not just coming from your manager, it provides that safe space for them and gives them an extra a window and extra perspective. And the man is still with the company today, doing fabulously, and he's become better at interacting with people. And he still has done a fabulous job in his tech role. Another example I have is I've worked in a lot of manufacturing shops, and it can be characters, right? People have different personalities. Well, I had one gentleman, I think he was in his 60s, and I say this because it was partly a generational issue. He was kind of a workplace bully to some of the younger workers, telling them that they didn't know what they were doing and they weren't doing things right, and downright calling them stupid. And of course, you can imagine, we got the complaints, and his manager and I sat him down, and we're like, well, are we going to write him up, or what's the issue here? What's the deal? We had to ask him, what's going on? And again, listening to him complain and go on, and us saying, but we won't tolerate you talking to your coworkers in such a disrespectful manner. What's truly going on here? I kid you not, it was probably not even 15 minutes in the conversation where he slammed his fist on the desk and just got so red-faced and burst into tears and said, I just care so much about this company and I want things done right. And these kids just are not trained up enough. They're not doing things right. And that's when I got to what I call the heart of the matter and was able to say, okay, I understand where you're coming from now. Your point of view is valid. We just need to work on how you interact with your coworkers and what we can do here. If there are valid issues with training, let's address them. And in the end, things did get a lot better. He was no longer bullying his coworkers around, and it was actually seen as someone that they can go to get the extra bits of training that they needed, a go-to person. So that was just a great opportunity to salvage a working relationship. And he did not lose his job. He had a write-up. It was a warning, but after that, that was the last one.
I think it's,
Elizabeth,
go ahead.
I was just going to ask one follow-up question to that. Both scenarios worked out great for both parties. Is there ever a concern with today's environment of war on talent and labor shortages? Is there ever a fear of approaching them for them walking out or losing that technical employee?
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely. That's why managers, I think, put up with it. And it becomes the culture of the workforce of, well, but he's really, really smart and we really need him. Well, you need to have the courage as a leader in a company to say, you need to address that. If it's creating an employee morale issue, if other people are quitting and you're trying to keep the one person that's causing everyone else to leave, that's a problem. But
Absolutely.
it is a very valid concern.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Katie.
Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate what Elizabeth was saying about so important to make sure that you're really getting to the root of the problem in the situation. I've seen so many times where employee conflict can just be a result of the manager not communicating effectively to the employees, maybe not communicating the expectations of the role or the workplace in general. So one employee may feel that the other employee is doing less work than them, or they have more flexibility or leeway than them. But by drilling down with each of those employees to really understand where that issue is, you can most of the time resolve it pretty quickly, but you have to open up those lines of communication. I know Corrine just had an investigation recently that ultimately came down to lack of communication and presence from leadership. So or if these leaders were opening those lines of communication, the whole situation possibly could have been avoided.
You're very right, Katie. Um, Communication is so important. And as we see in each of these examples, taking the time to really think about and listen and get to the heart of the problem is really important. I have a great example. I worked in an environment, we had probably one of the best performers in our agency, and the employee was late every day. There were a couple of days he would get there on time, but was consistently late. And supervisors, disciplined just as they were supposed to. They sat down and reviewed the policies, and the individual did everything they could to try and get to work. And got to the point where they were fed up. They didn't know what else to do, and he couldn't meet and comply with their requirements to get to work on time. So I met with the individual and sat down to get to the root of the problem. And what nobody had had the conversation is really why. Why couldn't you get to work on time? And what they didn't know is that he boarded a bus in Detroit at 4:30 in the morning. He took 4 transfers to get to work in the western side of the county. And so he was doing everything he could. He couldn't control when the bus was late, when this bus driver was late, when the next stop was late. So for him, he was doing everything he could do, and was a great employee. So getting down and sitting and talking to him and figuring out what was going on gave us the opportunity to look at things differently, right? We had the opportunity to say, can we do things differently? Can we have a different starting time? He had a team of people that waited for him, but the work could have been done if we had flexed that schedule. And we ultimately did that. We worked with the team. We sat down to talk about how it would impact the organization. And could we achieve both being him, giving him the time to be able to get to work, and also being able to get the work done that needed to be done within the organization. And ultimately, it worked out very well. He later ended up getting an opportunity to work at a facility that was closer to him, and didn't have to worry about that anymore. But the frustration of managers without listening or even diving in to figure out what's going on could have led to them wanting to terminate somebody who truly was doing everything they could to get to work. So
I love all of these examples. And I think sometimes as a manager, as an employer, you forget there's a human element, right? HR, human resources, human element too, that you have to get down to the bottom of to really help correct the situation. So thank you. Thank you, ladies. Let's discuss performance issues in general and how these conversations can be difficult. Elizabeth, would you like to start?
Yeah, let me kind of set the stage here to frame it up. Managers, they need to be having these conversations, providing employees with feedback, and then ultimately resources and tools and support to do their job. And maybe sometimes the support is outside of work needs, right? Sometimes they need to have the EAP if they're having a personal issue and so forth. And that's why having those conversations are important. Sometimes managers shy away, and even employees say they may shy away from sharing what's really going on. But it's important because in today's day and age, post-pandemic, people are opening up a little bit more, and more companies are offering resources to help support that employee for their life outside of work. So knowing just enough information and asking just enough questions to give them those support and tools is critical. And if it is indeed something where the performance is ongoing and you need to address it, let's face it, no terminations should be a surprise. Not until every and all other options and resources have been exhausted to help them. So the key is to focus on the issue at hand, not on the faults of the individual. Talk about why it's important for the entire team, how they are affected by these performance issues. And you want to get the employee to take accountability, get their buy-in about what the problems are. Ask the employee, what's going on? What do you think the issues are? How are things? How can we help you? And maybe they can't keep up with their workload. Maybe they have personal things going on at home. You can ask questions like, I'm just curious, how are things going for you? I can tell something's off. Something's not going well and it's impacting your work. Show concern. Show that as a manager, you care. So you can build that trust and ultimately provide the best support that you can for them. The more that managers can show that gentle concern and bring their own human side to the conversation, the more the other person's defenses will be lowered and their anxieties lessened. Because let's face it, I mean, it's tense having these conversations with your manager. But hopefully the employee will open up more to you, and that's when you can really start to get to the heart of the matter.
Elizabeth, I echo many of the things that you have said. There's a lot to be said about taking that time and really investing with your employees. And it has an impact on teams. It has an impact on an entire organization, has an impact on the individual themselves. Another example that I can share with you is one that kind of revolves around an employee who was very excited to join an organization. In fact, they had wanted to work for the organization for 10 years. The position had been posted 10 years prior and had never been posted again until 10 years later. And 10 years later, that employee was prepared to apply for the job, to interview for the job. They had gone and sharpened their skills and were ultimately hired by the organization. I remember his first day. It will always strike me, and I'll never forget his comments as he comes in. Mind you, it's been 10 years. He's been waiting for this job and he's been successful. And he says to me, he says, getting this job is like winning the lottery. You want employees to feel like that when they come into the organization, right? So you've got somebody who is excited. They're excited to be there. They have done what they needed to do to get the job, and now they're within your organization. So those words always stuck in the back of my mind as he proceeded forward in his position. And what ended up happening is we started to see him falling back. He wasn't the team player that we thought he was going to be. He shied away from projects that we would have thought he would have been a leader in. He was given a task and job duties that he should have been able to perform. He was a physical labor job. He would have been mowing and doing green belts and maintaining roadsides. And what we found is that when we went out to do big jobs, he would take the weed whipping. He would do the things that were minor. He fell right under that radar for a very long time. Managers had the conversations with him, hey, it doesn't seem like you're really a team player. Is there anything going on? No, I think I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. They tried to lay the expectations and say, this is really what we're expecting of you. But they reached a point where they were frustrated, right? They couldn't figure out what was going on. Proud guy, right? He thought he had all the skills. So they came to me and they're like, okay, it's a probationary period. It's the easy time to get rid of somebody, right? At least that's what managers always think. They forget the human resource side of things, which is we've taken a long time to get them and bring them into the organization. And we thought they had a good skill set. So what's going on? So we sat down. I sat down with them and I said, I'm surprised to be having this conversation with you. What's going on? How did we get to where we are? I want to understand how you came in here and were so happy and thought this job was about winning the lottery. But what happens is we're not seeing that in you. What's going on? So when you unpeel it, yes, he had skills. He was able to drive equipment. He had hesitated to load the equipment on trailers because he'd never had the experience with that equipment. So nobody trained him. He didn't have the he has transferable skills, but without knowing how to actually operate the equipment that they were using, or was afraid to damage any equipment by not being able to operate it and loading it on trailers. He shied back and said, well, I'm still being productive, but not in the way that not in the way that we would have expected him. So having that conversation led us to being able to get him the training that he needed, to bring him up to where he could be valuable and not be hiding under the wings. And those conversations are ones that peel it back and really are getting to the root of what's going on. The nice thing about him is he then, when he had the training, was a valuable asset to the group. And then when he was confident, you could see that in his performance, and he ultimately ends up being a supervisor in the organization. But it took him, you know, taking us a step back to figure out what's going on and having the conversations with them that aren't always easy, right? And, but we wanted that behavior to change, and giving him the tools to do his job was the right thing to do. They could have easily gotten, taken advantage of a probationary period and not let them continue, but instead have a very valuable asset in the organization today.
And if I can add on that, Karine, that just shows right there how critical it is for managers stepping into a management role, a lead role, supervisor role. They need that extra help and support. You often see how people, they're the rock stars of their department, and so they get promoted to management. Well, they were really an awesome sales rep, and now they're the sales manager, and they're still doing their sales rep job, or they're flailing in other areas. So that is a critical gap that in today's environment, especially the manager role, as soon as you start to have that career progression, which you definitely want to have that culture in your company, support, train, be there, have a coach, have a mentor. You can have a program that is as regimented or as open and relaxed as what fits your culture, and it's still going to be heads and tails above other companies who are doing nothing to bridge that gap. So I just wanted to share that. We just got our Gallup results in, and manager satisfaction is plummeting. It's it's hovering around 31% now, and managers are feeling the squeeze. And so that's why I am so happy that we're talking about this topic, because it really is about providing more tools to managers. And hopefully we can compel the managers listening here to self-advocate for yourself within your leadership of the tools and resources that you need to become even better and sharper to support your employees. Because employee engagement, which is a huge part of this, how to keep your employees engaged, enthused, productive, and just overall happy. They are the culture of the company. So it's just critical. And that's one of the things that here at Raymond and our HR solutions team, we're just super passionate about.
I want to flip it around here. What if employees are having issues with their leadership? Have any of you encountered this before? And if so, how do you recommend it being handled?
That's a great question, and I can jump in on that one to start. So I've encountered this multiple times actually, and this is when it's really important to make sure that your work environment has an open door policy so that your employees feel comfortable being able to speak to anyone, because that issue that they're dealing with could be with their direct supervisor. So by providing multiple avenues for them to go to share their experience with people is going to be very important. And by having that trusting environment, your employees will feel comfortable bringing that situation forward to someone, even if it's against the president of the company. So I had a situation with a client where multiple employees were concerned with how they were being treated by a client of theirs. And they felt that every time they brought this up to leadership, they were dismissed. So their concerns were not being heard. And they were pretty much just told, put your head down, push through. This is a big client. You know, we have to continue to please them. But by allowing them to have HR to go to, they were able to come and be open, share their concerns. It was actually first brought to me by another member of the leadership team. And he allowed me to then go interview individuals that were having this concern. And each of them brought their own stories about it, their own concerns about the situation, but they also had solutions to the problem. They just didn't feel comfortable at that time really providing those solutions to leadership. They felt that by their thoughts being dismissed, leadership was basically saying to them that they didn't have the company's best interest in mind and that they were just trying to get out of doing whatever work they were complaining about. So I was able to coach them and really get them to think about those I feel statements, you know, that we all hear about all the time. By utilizing those, but bringing those solutions to the table to leadership, they were able to be heard, but not be confrontational with that leadership either. And the leader ended up really taking that feedback very seriously. And they were prepared to confront that client regarding those concerns and ultimately terminate that client if they weren't able to realign on what those expectations were. So it really set the culture going forward, a new expectation for employees to know that leadership had their back, but they had to have that open environment to even allow that conversation to be had.
That is very compelling, that the leadership took that stance, Katie. I have another leadership story to add to that. This was another environment that I worked in a few years back, and it was an issue with the leader. It greatly affected the employee engagement and the morale in the workplace. It was a production environment. We had the production facility, the manufacturing was in the back of the building, pretty big building, and then the office was up front. And so being in HR, I was in the office side with the engineers and so forth. And so, you know, heard the stories of what was going on. And, you know, even on the walkthroughs going through the plant, when I'm around, when HR comes around, they kind of behave. So I was hearing stories of how the production director was just, he would roar at the employees. Well, over time, getting to know him, we got to be friends, but he would roar into the office. He'd always be complaining. And you'd always know when he was coming because people would start to cower. And it created that environment of, oh gosh, here comes a production director, and what's the problem now? And who's he going to complain about? And who's going to get fired? You know, it was just that tenseness, you know. And, you know, I went through a lot of hiring with him, a lot of quits. There were performance issues with employees. So he was in and out of my office quite a bit. And I'm pretty good at handling difficult people. But even my nerves got a little bit too rattled when we had talked to him about it. And it was, you know, even the business owner was like, well, you know, that's just how he is. And well, he comes into my office one day and I already had been a little bit tense, and he comes in roaring. You know, he would often have a beet red face and just, you could see the anger. He had something to say and it was never good. Always coming with the problems more than the solutions. And I literally did something very bold that in this case, taking it as a case by case basis, this manager needed to have this reaction from me. I said to him, you need to stop and get out of my office now. I cannot handle the way you're treating me, you're treating the employees. These outbursts need to stop. And I put my hands up. I said, look, I'm literally shaking. I cannot deal with this. So you need to leave. And he just had a shocked look on his face and kind of flustered. And then he left. And I took a minute and regained my composure. And I'm like, okay, well, maybe he'll come back in 5 minutes or not. I don't know. But I had to say it. And it took me a while to kind of shake the nerves off. And he came back the next morning and he knocked on the door and he peeked around the corner and, hi, can I come in? I said, absolutely, come in, have a seat. Mind you, this was someone I actually, up until a point where we actually had good moments of rapport. And so we sat down and he's like, what you said to me yesterday. And firstly, I'm just so sorry because I didn't know that I was creating that relationship and tension between us. Now, mind you, he was also doing that with the other employees. But I appreciated that he was concerned that it was affecting me that way. That made it personal. And so I said, I appreciate you saying that, but this is not healthy. This is not the behavior that we can continue here. We'll deal with the problems, we'll come up with solutions, but the outbursts and the yelling and the finger pointing need to stop. So are you ready? I have some pointers for you. Like, yeah, okay. And so, I mean, he was brought down. And because he can go from 0 to 100 really fast. And so I had this wonderful little sheet that was color coded. And it had emotions on it. What was acceptable in the workplace? It was a tool that I had gotten, and it was very handy in this particular situation, because instead of me telling him, you've done this wrong and this wrong and this wrong, and this person complained and this issue, I just asked him, take a look at this sheet and tell me what color you fall into that you resonate with your behaviors. And it was color coded from blue to green to yellow to orange to red. The blue and the green were emotions of congeniality, respect, dignity in the workplace. Yellow were the ones where it was a little bit cautionary. And then orange, of course, got into the more hostile. And then it was the red, which was, anger and outbursts and yelling and so forth. And so I said, just tell me what colors. So he's reading this and he's like, red, orange, yellow, red, red. Then he took a deep breath. And after he did, I don't know, maybe 8 of them, he's like, okay, I get it. And it was just like, I felt a sigh of relief too, that he saw where his behaviors, his normal behavior patterns were falling. And it wasn't me, it was him acknowledging it, owning it, and saying, I can work on this. Did I get him a mentor? No. Did I get him a coach? No. I just used that piece of paper to hold up in front of him like a mirror and say, what do you see as a problem? And that diffused, I'd say, gosh, 85% of it did not clear all of his outbursts or feelings, right? But it kept it lower. Maybe if it went into the orange a little bit, maybe a little bit to the yellow, but he was not acting out in the red any longer. And so we had a joke when through the rest of our relationship, and I still keep in touch with him today. He works someplace else. Then so do I. And I would say to him, let's keep it in the blue green. And it was just our little joke. But that's what kept it top of mind. And that was just such a useful exercise that I didn't have to go into huge amounts of detail or documentation, or, it just instantly got better from the inside out. And then it transferred over to the employees eventually realized, okay, it is different, And then he's at a company now where I visited him and I walked around the plant and I see the employees, and it's a different person. And you know, he's mellowed out quite a bit. And so I just joke with him and say, you're keeping it in the blue green. And you know, those types of things, you can be creative in how you're dealing with employees, especially in an upper management position, where they need to still hold on to that space and dignity, because they didn't get there overnight for nothing. They worked hard to get to that level in management, but they just needed that honest reflection. And when you do have a good rapport, as we did, you're the right person to help them.
I love that story, and I honestly can feel that I can remind myself sometimes to stay in the blue green in certain situations. So thank you for that, Elizabeth. These are all great examples about behavioral issues that we were able to turn into a positive outcome. I want to tackle another scenario. Let's talk about when performance issues can't be resolved. So in other words, let's talk about termination.
Yeah, it's interesting, Elizabeth, hearing your example there. I would have loved to have that tool as well in my toolkit in the past. It's a great one. I unfortunately had a scenario that did not end that well and did ultimately end in termination. And you know, terminations can come in varying degrees of severity. And this one was on the more severe side. It was an executive of a company. Again, the COO of the organization was actually accused of sexual harassment. And the employee did the right thing, brought the concern to human resources. It was specifically challenging, though, for this individual because the COO was that person's direct manager as well. And there were claims that the COO was making jokes that were sexual in nature and making these jokes out on the shop floor in front of other employees and including in front of vendors when they were on site as well. So it not only put that employee in a bad spot, but those vendors were now feeling uncomfortable in the workplace as well. So I spoke with the COO regarding their poor choice of jokes. That again were sexual in nature and how this was causing multiple people to feel uncomfortable. And unfortunately, the COO in this scenario, he just brushed it off. And he almost couldn't believe that I was having this conversation with him. It's almost like, oh, this is shop talk, right? And it wasn't sinking in with him. And I had a really close relationship with him. So I was able to speak very honestly with him, but just that seriousness, he wasn't looking at it in that way. And this employee was also instructed to kind of follow normal protocol in this scenario to make that COO aware that they felt uncomfortable in these situations and ask them to stop. And then I reiterated it to the COO, letting him know that his behavior, if this continues, that it could be seen as sexual harassment. And the employee was instructed to report back to us if this continued. And unfortunately, it did not stop. And in this scenario, the COO did end up being terminated from the company. So he failed to see the seriousness of the complaint. He chose not to look introspectively and change his behavior and ultimately lost his job because of that. So one thing that it did do, though, is it showed that employee and our vendors and other employees that every employee in that organization matters. So it doesn't matter if you're the COO or the person cleaning the bathrooms, you're important, and all employees at all levels are expected to treat everyone with respect and follow company policy.
Terminations are never easy, and I think they come in a variety of different situations, severity being one of them. But I look at, there's two other buckets that I think are difficult when we talk about difficult conversations and termination. There's two kinds. One, the terminations that nobody saw coming, and then the ones that the employee should have seen coming but didn't. When employers are downsizing or restructuring or deciding to go in a different direction, Those can be surprising to employees depending on how well the organization rolls that process out, right? We hear the stories of a paper box and a pink slip, and it's cold, and it is just as cold as it sounds, right? So taking into consideration when you, if you have the time when you are restructuring an organization, or when you're downsizing, eliminating a position, if you have the lead time, the most of those things are taking place when you actually have a plan, right? Maybe it's gonna be tied to next year, maybe it's tied to next quarter, maybe it's tied to something. But when you have that lead time, you have the ability to control a better outcome of how those situations take place. Um, Being empathetic and having a clear communication and compassion with employees is really important. Those will come as surprises that hit harder to them than the person who's been on a performance improvement plan, right? They should have probably known it was coming. There was some insight. These hit them like a ton of bricks, right? It affects their daily lives. It affects who they are, how they've done their jobs. They question everything. Why me? Being very candid and having open conversations with employees, giving them time to transition and potentially tell their families and their coworkers how that is happening before it all gets out. And then providing them a way to leave with grace and dignity, right? Um, let them have an opportunity to ask questions and listen very empathetically, right? That transition is not easy for anyone. If you have EAP resources, those are always very valuable. Many employees don't always think about them until they really need them. So ensuring that we support them in those efforts and making sure they have those resources as they transition really can be impactful on how the employee feels and how the organization uh, can be looked at and viewed once employees leave. So those are never easy. They're tough ones, right? They're emotional. They most of the times I have been involved in them, they're very emotional, right? People don't understand, and providing them with as much information as you can and acknowledging the accomplishments that they have had in the organization. It isn't a result of a reflection of what they've done, but more so about the organizational direction that people are going. I find those to be very difficult, but keeping in mind that they're human, and those are tough for people to take on. I think the other one that's complex is when you have somebody in an organization that should have known something and didn't. I have a great example of working in an organization where somebody had been hired, maybe and more as a friend or as a favor in the organization. So they felt that they were untouchable. And what would happen is uh, the supervisor over the individual didn't feel like they had the ability to address issues. So what happened is each time there was an opportunity to move this individual, they were the one that got moved. And so they would move under a different director and under a different director and under a different director. And in each case, nobody addressed the performance issues. Nobody addressed the behavioral issues. And the individual became the individual themselves pretty well thought that they were hands off and they could do whatever they wanted. That only lasts so long in an organization. And once he got transferred to a division that couldn't afford for people not to work and pull their weight, those conversations became very different. So he hadn't been approached on his performance. He hadn't been approached about his attitude or his behaviors and how he was conducting what little business he was conducting because he was untouchable. And so I had the opportunity to sit down with him and course correct those conversations, to sit down and talk about what was the expectation in this new division for which he actually reported to me, and what was going to be expected of him. How did I expect the behaviors within the team to work? we had the conversations about how could he integrate himself in, knowing that he had this attitude. We had to take a step back and figure out, was he going to be able to actually do what we wanted him to do and what he should have been doing for all the years that he had worked there? And we peeled it away. We peeled away each aspect of what we were working on, to the point where he was unclear. So everything became in writing, and we got very clear. Communications were extremely clear. We would we would assign tasks. We would come back. We'd have a conversation. Did you have any questions? Nope, that's great. And then we would really had to take it back to the basics. And we worked at that for quite a while. But what ultimately happened was he wasn't willing to work as hard as we needed him to work. He wasn't willing to put in the time. We had provided him with every resource. We provided him with training. We provided him with mentorship. We had provided him with coaching. He just couldn't get there. And at that point, when you have sat down with them a number of times and laid out really what's going to happen in the future, we like to call it self-select, but he was faced with the termination or choosing to leave on their own. And so we really reached the point of where we would have terminated him, and he chose to leave the organization. So those are ones where really those conversations and going back to the basics, and nobody's untouchable. And I think that's frustrating when it gets in. It's because of leadership, right? We feel that sometimes that we can't address problems that have been ongoing in an organization for decades. But you can. Some of it takes a lot of time and a lot of patience, but approaching it in the right way, you really can either get someone to join the team or find that they were better off not continuing, and it wasn't a good fit anymore. So I think that certainly was the case in this situation.
Absolutely.
Thank
Thank you, Kareen. Just for the sake of for the audience, we had mentioned EAP a couple of times. Would one of you just clarify, in case there's anybody that doesn't know, what does that stand for and what the definition is?
So I'm sure I can. EAP is an employee assistance program. It's a third-party vendor that a company can purchase, and it's really an affordable resource. It's different than your benefits plan, but it coordinates where every employee in your organization can have a confidential resource to reach out for counseling services for themselves, for their dependents, whether or not they're on the insurance or not. But the nice thing is you can design the plan that, say, the first 3, 5, 10 visits can be of no cost to them to get the therapy appointments that they need per person, per issue, per year. So it's an extraordinary benefit that is a very little investment. And it's a confidential way for employees to get resources without the manager or HR getting too much into the detail. So definitely check it out. If you don't have one and would like to know more, we can recommend vendors that we've used in the past.
Excellent.
Could I
And,
just add one? Oops.
Yeah.
I was just going to add
Yeah,
one
yeah.
thing to that too. It can be a valuable tool from the employer standpoint too. Everything's confidential, so we don't know what employees have utilized it. We just get an account number. But I've used, had such a good relationship with the EAP that I have used it in situations where employees needed to receive assistance and we had required EAP visits. So you can kind of bridge the two together, where an employer driven basically shares with the EAP what's going on in the organization, and it kind of takes it out of HR, puts it into some professional so that can help in the areas of to help that employee actually gain the tools that they need to be successful. So or address problems that have come up.
That is
Great.
a good point, Kareen.
Mhm.
I've used it for performance issues, for anger management.
Mhm.
I've used it for alcohol abuse, substance abuse, because
Yeah.
it was giving those employees that chance to rehabilitate what they needed to in their lives in order to improve their personal life and their professional life. So it's shows a lot of compassion when an employer uses an EAP.
Mhm.
And if I can piggyback on what you had said, Kareen, earlier about a layoff and how important it is in those shocking moments when someone is being told that their job is being eliminated, how to treat it very delicately and with dignity, and to be respectful of that. And I'd like to share a story of what I didn't directly but indirectly experienced. I had coached up a manager because it was a different location of how to handle this layoff. There were a few that were happening, unfortunately, and the person that was selected was a woman, and there was another person, a male, who was also a manager, but it was this particular woman who was decided that her role would be eliminated. And so I always go through the spiel, make sure that, what you say, what you don't say, give them space. She's a manager. She has people reporting to her. If she wants to go back and talk to her team, let her. If she wants to get up and leave and say, I don't want to talk to anyone, then let her. And so the termination happened. And then a few days later, I get notification of a lawsuit. And so I talked with everyone there. I even talked with the employee, of course, with legal. And it came out that why the female employee filed wasn't necessarily about losing her job. It was one pivotal moment in that termination meeting, that layoff meeting, where the manager, when the laid off manager asked, "Can I just go say goodbye to my team?" Because she felt bad for her team and she's crying, and she's just emotional. And the manager said, "Oh, no, no, I just don't think that they should see you in this state," because she was crying and puffy eyed and denied her. That sunk her heart so low. And that's exactly what I told the manager not to do. But it was a different location and out of state and so forth. And so anyway, I talked with the employee and I said, what happened? I was part of the liaison to negotiate this. And now that it was a lawsuit and the severance was being negotiated to be higher rather than actually going to court. And she said, that's exactly what it was. And she filed the suit based on gender discrimination, that she was selected instead of the other male manager. And we had proven through all of our data that wasn't the case. We were able to illustrate that to her lawyer. But had she not been denied to talk to her team, which was it was basically a reflection of saying, you're too weak looking to be talking to your employees. In her mind, something clicked and said, this must be gender related. And so it's highly emotional and you never know what can happen. So that's why I just share that lawsuits can happen. They can happen even if you do all the right things, right? But that's why when you do all the right things, you have a better defense. But when you make those tiny little things, those missteps, they are so emotional and get so deep. And ultimately for the company, they cut into the pocketbook, but also into the image, employee morale. I mean, it just further and further down the rabbit hole. So just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth. We are getting close on time, but we have one more important topic to address. I would like to talk about a topic that that it's very sensitive and many might find uncomfortable, but it's the topic that employers need to be prepared for, and that is gender identity. Kareen, can you talk about this and provide us more insight into what employers should be prepared for?
Absolutely. Gender identity is an area that people can be uncomfortable in, right? How you approach it will really outline whether or not you will be successful. If you've not had the situation yet, it's only a matter of time. So the first words of wisdom are to prepare your organization now, create an environment where it's inclusive and supports all employees. If you haven't looked at your application processes and you haven't modernized them to be to ask for preferred names and to ask for pronouns, to look at those types of things, it's very important. So at least you have some information coming in. The first time I had the opportunity to walk through this process with an organization, they were not well prepared. In fact, I think they just maybe never thought it would happen. The scenario involved a lifeguard who was transitioning. They were very traditional. They had female lifeguards who wore their uniforms and male lifeguards who wore their uniforms. They were very different. And it comes by way of a complaint filed by the transitioning employee because employees refused to call them by their preferred name. Now, they continued to call them by the name that they had called them for years. So the employees don't see what is happening to this individual. So the complaint really gave us an opportunity to sit down and talk with the transitioning employee who had not come forward before. Was that because the organization wasn't as open, or really didn't feel as inclusive, or that they felt that they could handle it on their own, or they just didn't need anybody? We'll never know what that really was, but I think that what we know is that it was a lot about communication and employee respect. And so I sat down with each of the employees that, there was a complaint that was in the complaint, and we had the conversations. They weren't aware of what they were just calling them by the name they always had, right? And so that became for him very almost harassing, right? It became where they were continuing to do something that they had asked him not to do. And for them, it was no big deal. For the transitioning employee, it was a really big deal. The transitioning employee, if you get that opportunity and they're willing to talk about what the process is, what their timeline is, how they want the organization to help them, those are great opportunities to lay it out and make it very successful. And again, it's really up to what the transitioning employee is willing to share, right? It's very personal to them. It is truly who they are, and that's what's hard for some people to understand, right? It's life changing for them in a way that's very positive for them. And the obstacles that they feel along the way only make that more difficult. And so by being prepared and when we say we have an inclusive environment, right? We hear that a lot, but have you really peeled back to understand, are you truly as inclusive as you need to be? Have we trained employees in what that looks like? Do we have a process by which we can help somebody going through that process? Having really candid conversations and being a place where people feel that they can come and talk, similar to a lot of the other scenarios we've talked about before. That a supportive environment is so critical to being successful. There are a lot of things that you'll address, right? Everything from the uniforms to the bathrooms to all of those tangible things. But it's the personal things that really are so critical in that process. Being open to communication. It's an interactive process, similar to if you were doing an accommodation, right? Finding out what the employee needs, finding out how the organization can help facilitate that and help them in that format, and having an opportunity for that feedback and exchange. And while we started off on a rocky start, I think employees valued that person as a person that they could have relied on for years, right? And so they ultimately, it wasn't easy. It wasn't like it didn't happen overnight, but by that individual being willing to talk about it and willing to share, and the organization willing to support the employee in that effort, that employee stayed employed with the organization after their transition and still with the organization. So it ended up being very good. It could have gone bad. We could have lost a valuable employee, and could have gone better. We could have been better prepared in that organization before it all started. But that wasn't where we were. Very new into that area. So it really is important to be considerate of what that employee is going through and that it is unique to them. So being flexible and empathetic, and really having those essential discussions is really important.
I know we only have 2 minutes left, so I'll make this very quick, but just want to reiterate, I have a friend who has experienced this from an employee's perspective, and everything that you just shared, Corrine, they've experienced as well, where it didn't go well because the company wasn't prepared for it. So they have seen 2 different people, a vendor and an employee colleague of theirs, going through these transitions, and it's just made everyone in the workplace uncomfortable because they don't know what should be allowed, how they're supposed to interact, what name they are supposed to use, what bathroom that person should be utilizing. And it's just made it really uncomfortable. So as you said, if you haven't experienced it, now's the time to prepare for it so that you can put all your employees at ease if and when that time comes.
Thanks, ladies. Team, this was a lot of information to unpack, from how to handle behavioral issues to gender identity. These have been great examples on how we can use your framework to navigate these critical conversations. And again, we're right at noon, but Elizabeth, do you have any final advice or any final thoughts before I wrap this up?
Or, I mean, all these situations, they're not uncommon, no matter the industry or the company. What's important is look at each employee's scenario individually, and then you can tailor the response to the fact patterns that you find. It's not something that a manager becomes an expert at overnight. And we're grateful as our HR team here at Raymond. We have decades of experience on our bench to handle these types of issues for our clients, to help them navigate this rocky terrain of these difficult conversations. And I always say, for every one question that a manager or a client has, we have 5. So we can really help pinpoint and help them navigate just the right way to approach it, to help their employees and just make this smooth sailing for them, and most effectively minimizing their legal risk and exposure.
Thank you. As we close out today's webinar, I want to remind all of you that we have recorded today's session, and it will be available to all of our attendees in the next 24 hours. If you do have any questions, I did see some come through the chat. We are more than happy to talk with you and help answer those. We will look through the questions that are in the webinar today, but also please feel free to reach out to the team directly. That email is hrsolutions@raymond.com. And as a final reminder, this session qualifies for 1 SHRM and 1 HRCI credit. We will now show that credit information on the screen. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.